If you can't hear me and would like to, put your hand up so I'll know to speak louder. If you can hear me and wish I'd stop, be kind. Be kind. It's a day for kindness. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Jack is also recording this. Thank you, Laila and Veronica, for playing. Thank you, Rosemary, for greeting. Thank you, Connie, for driving the brave shuttle bus. And now I say, welcome. Welcome to the family, the friends, the colleagues, the students, the neighbors, and the fans of Jim Maraniss. We have a variety and a splendor of blessings to share this afternoon. You've heard sublime playing. Soon you will hear singing, some of it by Laila and some of it your own. But first, welcome to the West Cummington Church, Jim's church. It is a place where every individual has been welcomed. So, welcome. Every kind of truth has been told, and there will be time to tell yours. Every kind of tear has been shed, and we will. Where laughter has brightened the driest Yankee, so laugh then, cousins, when it tickles. Where hands long gone have left their mark, and dreamers long dead have left their dreams. Welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit, and then family and friends will share remembrances, interspersed with Jim and Laila playing for us. And what I would say, I think, as you know, much of Jim's life was not easy. As you also know, he loved that life, and you, hard. Behold what that love has done. It has brought us here. That love has broken our hearts, and broken our defenses, and broken our silence, and we have stepped forth this afternoon to praise and to give thanks, to share joy, and to comfort each other. This love is the love that people long for, and here it is. This is the love people live for. This is the love that transforms us into who we were meant to be, into who we always really were in our hearts. You're going to hear some marvelous Jim Maraniss stories very soon. I'd like to tell a short one, if I may, but don't worry, I know I'm surrounded by experts, so I will keep this brief. Among his many gifts, Jim was good at, as they say, seeing something in someone that nobody had ever seen before. Yeah. I was the recipient. Victim? I'll go with recipient of his insight several times, and the one I'll tell you about was about 6 or 7 years ago on the 20th anniversary of me being the minister in the congregation, we had a celebration at a church service, and people were encouraged to speak from the pews, and a number of them did, and they said all sorts of kind things about my generous character, about how I wasn't all hung up on my masculinity or needing to be right. and it was embarrassingly gratifying. Maybe from their point of view, it was gratifyingly embarrassing. I don't know. Anyway, then Jim took a turn. He looked around and he said, all that may be so, maybe, but I see an iron-jawed, fire and brimstone Puritan preacher. And I'm thinking, what's he talking? And then I'm thinking, oh, yeah. Afterwards, a surprising number of people said to me, I never dared to say that, but he's right. And I think it was the best kind of education of drawing forth because I felt unmasked and finally visible to myself. Something in someone that nobody had ever seen. Several generations of students received that gift like sunlight, like rain, and they grew and they keep growing, and their students do too. A good teacher never dies. Good teaching never ends. But Jim's end was not easy. That brilliant vision and insight blurred. He'd say, I can't keep my thoughts. Drifting on a foggy, lonely sea, sometimes the weather was harsh. And for his family too. Sometimes he was lost to us. But now, for Jim, all suffering is over and death itself is past. May he find his clarity again. May he find ease with himself and some good seats behind the first base dugout. St. Paul said, for I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, not things present or things to come, not earthly powers, neither height nor depths, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. Your father, husband, brother, friend, colleague, your professor who professed love for his studies and his students, your neighbor by the river, is with God. And so are we. I welcome you to the presence of God in this place that Jim loved, in your neighbor. Take a moment and look around. Don't look at me. Look these people in the eye. Many of them won't bite. Yes, we are in the presence of God in this place and in the presence of your neighbor and in your soul. And I will say, just to end about Jim, he had extreme luck both ways. And we have too, to know him, lose him, love him. I would like to read you 4 lines of poetry attributed to Juan Boscan. And I didn't bring the Spanish because I thought, who would understand it? Then I thought again, and then I decided, I'll just stick with this, my own tongue. And Boscan wrote, if we had never known each other, there would be no pain. But we did know each other. Yes, we did. And the pain of parting is tremendous. But how much worse this pain would be if we had never known you. And know him we did, and we have a number of speakers lined up, as you know. And I think speakers, Gene and David and Ted, then a musical interlude, and then Lou, a couple of volunteers, I think, and Elliott and Ben is our lineup. So, without further ado, is Gene here? All right, thank you.
Can you hear me now? I'm Jim's sister, Jean, and Jim died 5 months ago, and I've had way too much time to think about what I want to say today. And I went over and over in my mind with all kinds of Baroque metaphors to describe Jim, and then a futile attempt to describe our family life in the Maraniss family, where Jim was the oldest, and I was second, and then my brother Dave and my sister Wendy, and our parents, Mary and Elliott Marranis. So I gave up on all that, and I'm going to keep it simple here and just say, Jim, I love you. Jim, I'm proud of you, and I miss you. And now I'm going to let Jim speak for himself for a little while here and share with you a few emails that I received from Jim in the last few years so you can hear his distinctive voice. The first one is from 2015, just shortly after Jim retired from teaching at Amherst College. And there was a nice ceremony for him then, and my husband Mike and I came down for that. And then Mike had cancer and he was undergoing chemotherapy, so I was sending out bulletins to the family, and this was what Jim wrote. Hi, Jean. Gigi and I are thinking about Mike all the time and greatly appreciate your updates. I don't really have anything to do for the rest of my life, but maybe something will turn up. Right now, I'm learning all about the Chaudière-Appalaches region. Why not? I enjoy saying things like, bonjour, madame. Maybe I should become a Catholic. I wrote to Jay and Hilka thanking them for the nice present they gave me, a box set of Sibelius symphonies. Number 4 is my favorite, the best, I think, or as they would say in Canada, the finest. Love, Jim. So I remember that Gigi and I thought, Jim started planning a trip to that very Chaudière-Appalaches region, which is along the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. And we thought it was just a pipe dream. We thought Jim was just fascinated by the French language and by the maps, and for some reason by his infatuation with Canada. But he actually planned a trip, and they did take a trip. And I remember Jim coming back and saying how much he enjoyed being there with these people who lived in a completely different world from ours. And he felt like it was really refreshing for him. Now, the second one is from the year 2020. So that's the pandemic already, right? Hi, Jean. Oh, I had written to Jim about a movie that I just watched, a 1962 Czech movie called Intimate Lighting, or in Czech, Intimní osvětlení. And I just loved it. It's about some itinerant classical musicians in rural Czechoslovakia. And he wrote back and said, have you seen Cutter's Way? Same director after he came to Hollywood. My 2 favorite movies. Intimate Lighting is subtler. Cutter's Way had Gigi's favorite actor, Jeff Bridges, and mine, John Hurd, who died recently. Love Jim. Anyway, so the director was Ivan Presser. And the third one's just a little bit longer. It's also from 2020. This is an illustration of the comic muse that Jim loved so much. And this one, I had found a poem that Jim wrote on the internet a long time ago about a trip to Cuba that he took with his friend Bob Stone. And I posted it on Facebook, I think. And Jim must have seen it because he was a lurker on Facebook. He never posted anything. But if he wanted to say something, he would send you an email instead. Hi, Jean. I'm glad Mike finds something to do in his office. Wish I could say the same. Gigi goes out and performs all the essential tasks, and I try to leave her alone. I've been reading a lot, but have trouble staying interested. Piqued by your interest, I found another old poem that I wrote and forgot about 40 years ago. It's about the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, who at the time was disgraced because of his ridiculous involvement with an exotic dancer named Fanny Fox. He was from Arkansas, I think, and his name was Wilbur Mills. The current chairman of Ways and Means is my congressman, Richard Neal. So here's the poem, Ways and Means. It could be that he had 1 year to live and had been told, but in a waste of shame at being mortal, had declined to give the voters back at home their rightful claim to his immeasurable days. New script, a tart. The woman he'd been born to love walks in. Notice her movement, camera in an arc. Tracks round, ducks gently, straightens up again. Print that, a lambent blue angelic prop. The Philadelphia Orchestra's soughing slop fades in and out at his direction. Tears of Pierrot exploding on the ground at the Capitol, both versions, silent and sound. And then he ended with this. Looking at this now, I don't like the fourth line. Too banal. And Pierrot is too derivative. But at least the whole thing scans as a sonnet. I like the use of the Philadelphia Orchestra, which came to me just because of the rhythm, yet fits in a way. This process seems poetic, but who will ever know or care, except one sister? Love, Jim.
I'm Dave, Jim's little brother. Thank you, Gigi, for organizing this celebration of a wonderful person. And Steve, thank you. I never noticed that fog. I guess I was lucky. I talked to Jim the few hours before he left us. And we talked for an hour, and he seemed as cute as ever and always smarter than I was. But then at the end he said, well, I could talk for a long time, but I'd just bore you. Jim did a lot of things, but he never bored me, ever. One of Jim's Amherst friends, maybe someone in the church today, once said that Jim was so laid back he was prone. It seemed that way, at least to the outside world. And it was true and not true, just like so many things with Jim. He was like a great coach who understood his own vulnerabilities and used that understanding to teach and inspire his players. Jim could do that with his students and with strangers. Internally, he was like Walker Percy's moviegoer, always in the audience of his own life, critiquing it, worrying about it, often more than living it. Yet somehow he was able to convey an air of complete relaxation and fearlessness, and that was real, not phony. Once at a wedding reception in Washington, a black guy in his late 20s came up to me and said he'd been one of Jim's students at Amherst. Man, I love Jim, he said. I'd heard that so many times before, and usually I'd smile and say something like, yeah, I do too. He's one of a kind. But this former student took it one step further, and he said, in fact, I always wanted to be Jim. I wrote about this in an essay about being his little brother and said, this well-dressed black guy who had played intercollegiate sports at Amherst wanted to be Jim? What was that about? I can't imagine that he wanted to have Jim's fragile body, his chronically weak legs, and various psychosomatic ailments. And there are a lot of people who look bolder and more self-assured. But Jim seemed so easy natural, and unburdened by the normal pressures. So different from the white upper-class ambiance of Amherst. What he was relaxed and fearless about was what most people obsess over: ambition and power. He wanted to be recognized, but only if it could happen without him breaking a sweat. He succeeded at some of the most elite institutions in America: Harvard, Princeton, Amherst, yet totally rejected institutionalism and hierarchy. He didn't abide by routines. He lectured for as long as he had something to say, then stopped and dismissed class, ignoring the standard schedule. He played pool with his students and talked football with them, or movies, or small towns in the upper Midwest, or Slovakian surnames. He knew something about everything. He taught what he wanted. His classes ranging from Spanish to Cervantes, to the Spanish Civil War, to French cinema, Nazi propaganda. He was a notoriously lenient grader. He had a fantasy baseball team called the Rojos and was always inquiring about American League prospects. In the old days, in that big white house, overloaded with books and newspapers, dirty dishes in the sink, kids everywhere, classical music or reggae playing, an amazing wife, Gigi, offering wisdom and a sympathetic ear to anyone who dropped by. It became sort of an off-campus student union. So who wouldn't want to be Jim? Jim was my big brother, almost 5 years older than me, but 6 years ahead in school because he was so smart and skipped a grade. He left for Harvard before I reached junior high. Before that, he'd done what big brothers do. He'd pin me to the ground and slap me around pretending it was the Nazi Gestapo. Where do you live? Oh, you lie. He shot me in the back of the knee with a BB gun at our grandfather's farm. He broke it to me when I was 5 that Santa Claus didn't exist. He taught me scatological songs about school cafeterias. And since we shared a room, he complained that I was keeping him up at night with my pathetic asthmatic wheezing. But of course I worshiped Jim, and I still do. I think of all the images I hold of Jim, the one that lingers goes back to our days in the old house at 1619 Regent Street in Madison, with its low ceiling and 3 turns up a staircase up to the 2nd floor, a wooden staircase. Jim and I shared a bedroom up there before he left for Harvard, and during the summers of his college years when he worked at American Breeders or my dad's newspaper, the Cap Times. I'd usually be in bed before he came home at night, and I could always hear him coming up the stairs, step by step. His body was all crackling ankle joints and knee joints. Every step, another crickety-crick and crack all the way up. And I can still hear that symphony. It was Jim. Jim's coming home.
Thank you, Stephen, for welcoming us here, all of us. And Gigi, thank you for inviting me to speak about Jim. Jean and David, thank you for describing someone I know and that we share. It was really nice to hear what both of you had to say. And it's very nice to look out and see so many familiar faces. Though, like you, I kind of wish I wasn't here. Ah, good, thank you. Anyway, no, if it's annoying, tell me to stop. It's really nice to look out and see so many familiar faces. Though, like many of you, I kind of wish I wasn't here. Jim slipped into my life as a freshman at Amherst, kind of the way Humphrey Bogart's Rick comes into the film Casablanca. I heard a lot about him before finally laying eyes on the guy. Among the odd collection of residents in Valentine Hall in 1978, Jim inspired a unique mixture of affection and bewilderment. Among the residents was a guy named Neil Banta, who had been randomly assigned Jim as his freshman academic advisor. The shaping force in Banta's youth was his high school swim coach, a sandpaper voiced Marine named Gantner,
who'd been in combat on both Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Stoked with this predilection for male authority, Neil would head off to meetings with Jim to discuss his Amherst education and return, as you can probably imagine, bemoaning a certain absence of rigor in their conversations. That guy is so laid back. I think he may actually smoke dope. One evening, I passed Neil in the upstairs hall of Valentine shaking his head over a front-page story in the Amherst Student about tenure cases. Pointing to a photo of Jim, the faculty in question had all their pictures on the front page like mugshots. He muttered, "I just don't understand this place. Maraniss got tenure." Then I turned the corner, and there was Roberto Amelli. He was a Puerto Rican vet who'd come back to school, an older student who just loved Jim. He was headed off to Jim's house to celebrate, all spiffed up, with a bottle of surprisingly decent champagne tucked under his arm and a rolled joint in his breast pocket. I'm off to see Jim. When I finally did meet Jim, it was as his student in one of the big lecture halls in Merrill Science Center. He was at the floor, surrounded by Rick Griffiths and Jeff Carr. They were teaching a second semester Introduction to Liberal Studies course called A Sense of Tragedy. Rick and Jim handled Euripides and Racine, as you'd expect. But Jim smuggled in 2 films, John Ford's The Informer and Fritz Lang's The Big Heat. Stories full of social force and violence that didn't end well, but tragedies? They were chosen, it seemed, not because they were expected, but just because Jim liked them. It was my first taste of his remarkable associative range and my first experience of talking about film seriously, an experience that changed my life. Jim could tie together disparate elements into a conversation or an essay or a speech like no one I've encountered. In the process, he'd turn the mundane into something poetic and leave you changed. Jim's moral perspective was so wrapped in the loose clothing of aesthetic and phenomenological appreciation that you could miss it completely. Whether he was talking about Shostakovich, baseball, or his youth in Wisconsin, you couldn't quite perceive what his moral center was, but it would hit you unexpectedly. I'm going to give you a make-believe example. I don't think this is something he actually said, but it sounds like something he'd said. He'd sort of weave compassion and interest. My 4th grade teacher in Madison, a Pole named Dowachinsky, was haunted by her husband's death by firing squad outside Warsaw. You could imagine Jim saying something like that. And then he'd mix it with a journalist's eye for detail and a little insouciance. Ms. Nowachinsky had a fondness for tight-fitting floral summer dresses, a little too tight. And he'd do this so well, you'd be spellbound and completely surprised when towards the end of the story he'd deliver a startling verdict, unfailingly over the top of his glasses. But you know, Ted, she was a fascist. And of course, an anti-Semite. In a similar way, he felt such an instinctive affinity for people in trouble that when he volunteered to join your side, it might take you a little while before you wondered if there was something doomed about the endeavor. I came back to teach at Amherst for a semester in 1994. And one night, in what I could best describe as a state of emotional extremis, I floated the idea of heading to New York to crash the wedding of a very recently ex-girlfriend. Jim said, "Why don't I go with you, Ted? We'll make a road trip of it." Looking back, I like to think that he offered to keep me company, not because he thought it was a good idea, but because he had the profound decency to allow me to come to my senses on my own. It didn't take long. Flushed with a feeling of comradeship, I pictured the 2 of us at the back of a church in Lower Manhattan, and suddenly the harebrained foolishness of the whole scenario hit me like a bucket of cold water. "Jim, maybe I should sleep on this." "Sure thing, Ted, just let me know." Then he slipped away, saying, "Well, I think I'll head home and see if I can get lucky with Gigi tonight." That spring of 1994, Jim opened the doors to himself and his life in the most guileless, inviting way. We'd hang out at the house/daycare on Woodside as the runts came and went, watch the Lillehammer Olympics late at night with Gigi and Ben, speculate on what it was that made Elliott seem as though he was laughing at his own private videotape of Beavis and Butthead, and take in wondrous Lucia's junior softball season. In the middle of my life, at the time I was least expecting it, he became the kindest and most stimulating of friends. And as I got to know more about his peripatetic childhood and the ways in which his parents had suffered the cruelties of McCarthyism, I understood better his fondness for lost causes and the films of John Ford and Fritz Lang. It was a lived experience of injustice that he wore so lightly and gracefully. The last long talk Jim and I had, it was late last summer, was about the cross burning that had occurred in front of the Charles Drew House when I was a freshman. It was a convulsive event in the life of the college. The campus shut down for several days, Converse Hall was occupied, and it eventually came out that 3 black students had set the fire. Jim told me that he volunteered to represent them before the faculty committee that was going to determine whether they'd be expelled. He said, "I wanted to do it, and no one else did." He talked with the students, who explained that they had, partly urged on by a professor of theirs, done it to expose racism at Amherst College. Then Jim said to me with that flat, uninflected delivery he reserved for matters of moral seriousness, and I could hear him looking over the top of his glasses at me. And Amherst College was a racist place then. But his view was tinged with such affection for the college and such compassion for the faculty committee. They didn't realize the place was that way. How could they? He understood them without condemnation. The approach Jim and those students took was to tell the faculty committee stories about their experience of race at Amherst in the late 70s. And it worked. No one was expelled. They were all welcomed back to Amherst. Though I'm not sure they all chose to return, and Jim didn't know either. Jim's story of that event stayed with me, and I thought there might be a short film in it. I was planning to ask if he'd be up for shooting an interview the next time I saw him, but then he was gone. I don't know if Jim believed in ghosts, another question I never got to ask. Whether he did or didn't, I can imagine his response peppered with some ranked opinions about the ghosts in Shakespeare's plays, and a memory of some Cuban pitcher who had one great season with the Twins and between batters reportedly talked on the mound with the spirit of his drowned brother. But whether Jim believed in ghosts or not, in that last conversation, he made a final deep impression and then slipped out of view in a way that's left me feeling he's somehow still there. He had a knack for doing that.
When James Taylor was in the creative process of composing this next song that Gigi asked Jim and I to perform, he asked Jim Maraniss to contribute some lyrics in Portuguese, which he did, and I will read to you the translation of those so that when it comes up in the song, you'll know what's being said. When our mother wakes up, we will walk in the sun. When our mother wakes up, we'll sing through the wilderness. When our mother wakes up, all the children will know, and they will rejoice. More than a distant land, over a shining sea, more than the steaming breeze, more than the shining eyes. Well, they tell me it's only a dream in Rio, and nothing could be as sweet as it seems on this very first day down. They remind me, son, have you so soon forgotten? Often as not, it's rotten inside, and the mask soon slips away. Strange taste of a tropical fruit, romantic language of the Portuguese, melody on a wooden flute, samba floating in the summer breeze. You can stay asleep, you can close your eyes, you can trust the people, the paradise. So call your keeper and tender your goodbyes. Oh, what a night, wonderful one in a million night. Frozen fire, Brazilian stars. Southern Cross. Later on, take you way downtown in a tin can. I can't come down from the bandstand. I'm never thrown for such a loss. When they say, quando non sa mai accordar, andaremo so sol. Quando non sa mai accordar, cantarà bello certain. Quando non sa mai accordar, todos sos fios saberán, todos sos fios saberán, e regocijarán. Caught in the rays of the rising sun, on the run from the soldier's gun, shouting out loud from the angry crowd, mild, the wild, and the hungry child. I'll tell you, there's more than a dream in Rio. I was there on the very day, and my heart came back alive. There was more than the singing voices, more than the upturned faces, more than the shining eyes. But it's more than the shining eyes, more than the steaming breeze, more than the hidden hills, more than the concrete Christ, more than a distant land, over a shining sea, more than a hungry child, more like another time, born of a million years, more than a dream. dear friend and colleague, Louis Spratlan.
That was beautiful. I'm afraid this is hopeless, but I'll get it together. Here, thank you. Thank you. Melinda and I moved to Amherst in 19... Melinda and I moved to Amherst in 1970. I lived in a little bowling alley house, the one white house on Walnut Street that runs between the theater, Kirby Theater, and Woodside. Only for 1 year, because we had 2 yapping dogs that drove our neighbor wild, and we had to get out of there. Right. Robert Ward, Dean of Admissions at Amherst at the time. So we fled, and we set up camp in our place on Orchard Street, a house immediately next to Pratt Field. We showed up first. We took the front apartment, and Jimmy, Gigi, and newborn Ben showed up not much after that. And in a matter of hours or maybe days, Jim was my total soulmate. We were a family, the Bachelors, irreplaceable family. I never made that straight through. Most recently, this past Thanksgiving, which is the last time I saw Jim. And that I have to mention this moment when we moved together, because it was like nothing else. They, at the time, had a fabulous Airedale named Reagan, who bore, if I remember correctly, 16 puppies as a result of 14. That's right. Sorry. One was stillborn, I remember that. That was thanks to a dalliance in our joint basement. Well, never mind. I can say no more than about this, and it was a remarkable coming together of 2 families and turning them into one. Next thing I have to tell you is about a star-crossed situation that occurred in the early 70s when one of my professors at Yale, Yehudi Weiner, a great composer, brought together Herta Glatz Redley, the impresario, or impresarios, of the New Haven Opera Theater. Herta had asked Yehudi for a recommendation for somebody who might write an opera on commission for them. And Yehudi recommended me, and Herta had me over to her house for a drink. Tea, she called it. On a Sunday afternoon. And we didn't chat more than 10 to 15 minutes of just formal how do you do's. And she reached to the table, handed me a copy of La Vida es Sueño, Calderon's great play. She said, I think this might make a good libretto. La Vida es Sueño, life is a dream. Dream. Thank you. I read it that night and said, yes. The funny thing is that Jim and I knew each other incredibly well, but I didn't know exactly what he did. And he revealed to me that he was a scholar of Spanish, and that his specialty was Calderon's Life is a Dream. I said, well, that fixes it, doesn't it? And off we went. And Jim created one of the great opera librettos in existence, and that's counting Hoffmannsthal and the Ponte and all the rest. The libretto to Life is a Dream, am I not right, Ted? Yeah. We dove into it act by act. He finished all of Act 1 before I wrote a note, but we talked constantly once it was launched. And we figured out one or two crucial things, changes that we were going to make to Calderon. How dare we? The most important one is that Calderon's ending is tragic, and ours is not exactly comic, but it's human in a way that Calderon's isn't quite. He finished the first act. We had talked a lot about this swerve and that swerve in this corner and that corner, and how it was going to read. And then he finished the whole first act, and just as I thought it was perfect, and I sent him off. Go away, get going on the second act, and I'll produce the music for the first act. And sat down and wrote it note for note from the beginning. And here's the important thing I want to get at. Jim's words left me only one choice, which is to render his own music into music that we think of in the ordinary sense of the term, with notes and rests. The music was built in to the words. I had it served to me on a platter. I'm not kidding. And I'm going to close with a sample. Segismundo, the hero of Life is a Dream, has been exiled as a child as a result of the prophecies that his father Basilio had experienced upon the child's birth. He was banished to a tower in the wilderness. He was tutored by Clotaldo, one of his father's trusted friends. But he harbored the obvious yearning for freedom that anyone in such a circumstance would. And we are exposed to his first remarks about this quest for freedom by some passers-by in the wilderness who just happened upon him. And they see him performing the following soliloquy. With freedom, I'd be a giant. On stone foundations, I'd build mountains of jasper, climbing to burst the crystal windows of the sun. This is the language of Jim Maraniss. I'm colloquial and utterly exalted at the same time. Thank you. I love you, Jim.
Now, we have left space for others, and then come the brothers. And two people have gotten in touch with me during the week, and I wonder if you are here, gentlemen, and that is Ed Pitoniak, okay, and Rich Thompson. All right, let's go, Ed, and Rich, you can be the close.
My name is Ed Pitoniak. I was the class of '78 at Amherst. Ted, I think maybe we overlapped by 1 year, if that was the year you got there. Jim was Catholic, with a small c. And his Catholicity, I experienced in a way, I think Rich might end up talking about somewhat the same thing, but Rich, I will not steal too much of your thunder. David, you spoke of the athlete you met in D.C. I was a farm kid, an athlete from Westfield who was fortunate to get scholarships to Mount Hermon and to Amherst. And in the 70s, you could be this size and be an athlete at Amherst. But I was so blessed to come into Jim's company. And it took me a while to find my way at Amherst. And I think part of finding that way was realizing there were certain professors who believed, I'm sure with full justice, that their job was to lead us away from mystery. I started out as an anthropology major because I thought these cultures around the world were so fascinating and mysterious. And then I realized these guys actually think this is science. So I hightailed it for the English department. And I was blessed to come into the company of people like Dale Peterson and Armour Craig, Henry Bromell, who was with us for a brief spell. My one big regret is I didn't get to study with Professor Pritchard, who was here a moment ago. But I came into the company of Jim, and I had the good fortune to do a senior tutorial with him in reading Borges. I will testify here with utter truth and sincerity, I actually did the reading. But as Ted has noted, we didn't talk about the reading very much. But what Jim gave me a sense of was the way in which life lived, the life of the mind, the life of the soul, the life of the heart, is a life that has to embrace mystery. He was the first person who taught me the meaning of the word antinomian. Now, I'm not going to pretend to try to define it here with any kind of clarity, but he helped me realize the way in which you have to accept the fact you cannot work your way to utter clarity. You can try as hard as you should. You should have as much clarity in your life as you can. But grace, what Jim taught me is that grace involves mystery and accepting mystery. Not mystification for the sake of mystification, but grace and the embrace of mystery. And I was able to witness that after graduation because Gigi and Jim would graciously host me as I spent the year after Amherst trying to figure out what to do. And what I also saw is that you could live the life of the mind, the life of the soul that Jim lived, and yet create this amazing thing called a family. And I think it was the first time I'd seen a family outside my own family where I thought, this is the kind of family I want to have. So I can't wait to hear from the kids. I will just stop by saying that, or end by saying that time with Jim was always transporting, and I will always miss him.
Thank you. I first want to say thank you to Gigi for the invitation and the opportunity to share some remarks about Jim at this beautiful event. I'd like to tell you a story about how Jim impacted my life profoundly. I first met Professor Maraniss as an Amherst sophomore when I enrolled in his Spanish 43 Cervantes class. Many years later, Jim would inscribe my paperback copy of Don Quixote after we had become friends by divine providence. Most Amherst students were familiar with Professor Maraniss, and his Cervantes class was known as one you had to take. It met twice each week in a crowded Merrill Science lecture hall. I never missed a class, even after a late night at Chi-Phi or DU. Almost immediately, students realized that Professor Maraniss taught that class because he wanted the whole of Amherst to share his love for Cervantes. And what better way than having us all read Don Quixote together? I was one of many students who listened attentively to his lectures and tried unsuccessfully to impress him with questions or comments after class or during office hours. Clearly, I was not one of his better students, and I never felt that I had made any real connection. I intended to take another of his classes, but that never happened. After graduation from Amherst in 1980, I was fortunate to postpone my entry into the real world by playing professional baseball for 16 years. I played for 7 organizations, mostly in the minor leagues, for meager wages, but always chasing my dream. Looking back, I would not trade that experience for anything, although there were many obstacles along the way that tested my resolve and had me weighing the wisdom of continuing my quest. In 1987, at an emotional crossroads in my career, I received an unexpected postcard from my former professor, Jim Maraniss. At that moment, I had been discussing my future plans with my parents, two people who understood, excuse me, who understood why their 29-year-old son had stubbornly persevered in his chosen career path, even though his chances of returning to the major leagues were waning. Even with my parents and soon-to-be fiance's support, continuing in my baseball career was becoming increasingly difficult and impractical. In that moment of doubt in 1987, as I sat at the kitchen table, I could not imagine why Professor Maraniss might be writing to me, or why my mother had taken that moment to interrupt the conversation and hand me his postcard, dated 9/8/87. I cried as I read Jim's message. Jim Maraniss understood. Quote, "Dear Rich, met a freshman yesterday whose father owns the Memphis Chicks. He said you had recommended my course. I don't remember you, but I've been following Rich Thompson, the ball player, from Cleveland to Vancouver to Memphis, through Baseball America, and thinking that there is a guy I wish I had known as a student. Now I learn that in some sense I did know you. Well, it's the biggest payoff I've had yet at Amherst. I'm glad you had a season in the big leagues because so few do. But I think that your continuing to play in the minors shows more poetry and spirit, is more quixotic than anything I've heard about any other student. And I know there is a recording angel taking note of what you do. Best regards, Jim Maraniss." Now, I believe that was divine providence, not of the monumental kind, but divine providence, no less. Professor Maraniss's perfectly timed message validated my career choice, uplifted my spirits, and motivated me for the balance of my 16-year career. His postcard went everywhere with me. 49 states, 6 countries, millions of charter, bus, and frequent flyer miles, and it hung on the shelf of my locker in every clubhouse, including the Montreal Expos in 1989. I've thanked Jim many times for his postcard and his friendship, and for teaching my daughter Daphne, class of 16, during her freshman year at Amherst. At his retirement party in 2015, I reminded Jim that his postcard and his friendship was the biggest payoff I'd had yet at Amherst. Thank you.
Is Jim Warren here? And I understand you would like to speak, and I know that you would like to listen.
Well, I apologize for barging in on this. I have a truly crazy day with service here and high school graduation party at our house tonight, which means it's impossible. Anyway, I've got to be back at Bradley as soon as we're done, but I got up really early this morning and just wanted to write something and realized all the folks who are going to precede, undoubtedly, David, and I had no idea about Rich, and I'm not sure one can possibly top that and the sag of the postcard. But I decided just to hit my Gmail account and see what was there. Oh my God. Several libel or slander suits, among other things. But let me read a couple of these. A discussion about an Amherst professor who was suing the college for something, and at the same time I needed to know what his views were on guys getting into the Hall of Fame who had obviously been cheating on steroids. This is 2016. I hate to see Schilling get in. He's such an asshole. Not that that would disqualify him. The accusations against the college are based entirely on the complainant's work diary. She was dismissed because of low enrollments. I think that, and I better leave this guy's name out, is lurking behind this, but I am mercifully apart from the department. Then I had asked him one day about a Cervantes biography that was in the New York Times review section, and what he thought of it, and also mentioned that I had some piece on the 2016 election and how the media was covering it in the college magazine. I'll get a print copy thanks to the tip. Gigi and I have read your piece in the magazine. There is nothing we'd rather read. We're for Bernie, which won't surprise you. Then he told me about a gathering in New York City that he and Lou were hosting at the Academy of Arts and Letters. All is well here, although in retirement I'm starting to feel like some aged or maroon pirate from Treasure Island, Ben Gunn or maybe Blind Pew. Of course, there was always baseball. There was one night I was at a White Sox game, and I emailed both David and Jim that I had just gotten my son a jersey of a Cuban ball player, Alexi Ramirez. Jim responded by wanting to know about a couple of other players. Is Dwayne Wise getting any special respect in Chicago? Are the fans rooting for him? Maybe I told you, my team, and most of our exchanges involved his rotisserie baseball team, which had a decided ethnic and racial orientation. I think Caucasian males were not ever drafted by Jim. Well, no, this is an exception. My team's future right now depends on Polacks. Anthony Swarzak, Mark Rapinski, and Scott Kazmir. So there was the Polish exception, I guess. And then a few days later, I told him that, that Polish pitcher was pitching that night against my beloved Yankees. I said, I assume you're rooting for him, and he responded, yes, for ethnic reasons I am. Rip Rapolsky, Richie Ziss, Moose Skowron, Tony Kubek, Carl Yastrzemski, also Tadeusz Kosciuszko, someone everybody in Chicago should revere, then Dan Rostenkowski, the crooked former congressman, Anton Cermak, the mayor who was murdered, Frederick Chopin, Joseph Conrad, and Wanda Landowska. Now, maybe Ms. Spratlan, Wanda Landowski, for the few of us ignorant folks out there, was a Polish harpsichordist of the early 20th century, as if I should have known. A couple of final ones. I asked him in 2010, I said I was writing a column for the New York Times, and I wanted to have fun with the realization that the odious Canadian newspaper baron Conrad Black was writing regularly from prison for National Review magazine. This particular week, he had some review of a book on Henry Luce. I said, what would be other writers to cite as having labored from behind bars? Response, Cervantes was in prison in Seville. His accounts didn't balance or something when he was working as a provisioner for the Armada, and that's where he probably started writing part one of Don Quixote. He has as much said so in the prologue. Oscar Wilde, The Ballad of Reading Jail, Francois Villon, medieval French poet, and of course, there was Solzhenitsyn. Finally, a couple of ones. I'd asked him about a serious piece on welfare reform and asked him for his reaction. Somehow, he turned that into a comment on the state of the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. The Rays are for real. Someone said they reminded him of the '98 Yankees. I don't know. I never follow the Yankees. But there was a player named Marcus Thames, T-H-A-M-E-S. But I like Marcus Thames. His name, which sounds like that of a coddled Negro slave about to lead a rebellion. Your welfare pieces were very moving, but we do live in a mean-spirited republic. And finally, my last exchange with him, just April 20th, 2021, I simply asked, hey, how are things? And I knew things weren't all that great. Response, okay, I keep improving, not quite sure for what, if one ever is. But you have young children. Our youngest, Elliott, comes out here every weekend to play Scrabble, which is more momentous than it sounds. Indeed, and as I step aside, I assume Jim is still playing Scrabble, and formidably so. And if he were here, I would tell him that in yesterday's White Sox-Texas Rangers game, 2 Cubans got base hits, and the White Sox blew a 5-0 lead. I think which would be perfect for him. Glory and tragedy all together in one. Anyway, thank you so much and for giving me a couple minutes.
And I think now,
Yes, I'm a volunteer.
God bless.
Thank you. My name is Connie Congdon, and I'm a playwright, and I was at Amherst College until I retired. So, two things about today. All of our memories have made me miss him even more, but I wanted to explain why his old friend Tom and I were late. This is Thompson Webb, who went to high school with Jim, and it was a professor at Braun, and we went to the wrong church. Now, I don't think Tom nor I are church people, but the very nice residents of Cummington, two guys with lots of facial hair and the biggest pickup truck I have seen, and I know pickup trucks, said, "Are you two waiting for something specific?" So we told them what, and they said, "It's probably in the other church." And they gave us instructions, and Tom actually knew how to do this because he went to Earth Dance, which Earth Dance Tom. It doesn't fit, but it actually does fit. Hello, Lou, my beloved. Hi, sweetie. Anyway, so that's why we were late. But then I had two really brief stories about Jim. And one of them is he was hired to come and speak someplace. And he ran into me, and since I'm in the theater, and he said, I'm really, really, freaked out about this. I'm worried about giving this speech. And I said, Jim, they don't want Toastmaster of the Year. I mean, we have colleagues who are those people, and they did not ask them. They want you, Jim. They want you with all of your pauses and your moments to think, and then your contradictory statements and the moments of passion when you get completely carried away. That's what they want. They want you, Jim. And he was so sweet. He said, "Thank you, Connie." And he embraced me. And I still feel that. The other thing, at his retirement party, he had a reading of the Calderon, and he had several of his friends read it. And what he did is he researched and found the key, most emotional moments in their lives and described them. And for instance, Uta had been in Germany when some huge thing happened, and I'm sorry, I'm ignorant, I don't remember, and he said, "You must have seen the lights from where you lived and known what that was going to mean." And he went through everybody, and he told these stories. People die all the time, and as we get older, they're happening more. But God damn it, when I wrote Gigi the note, and I just said, I could have stood another 10 years. I mean, I didn't expect him to be eternal, but I mean, really, Anyway, I miss him, and I wanted to tell the story, Daphne's father, who I taught Daphne, and he stopped me in the parking lot, and he said, "I want to show you something that I got from this professor, Jim Maraniss, and I carry it with me." He opened his billfold, and there was the postcard. So, bless him.
Elliott and Ben, are you here?
Yes.
All right. Would you like to?
So I'm sure everybody in this room knows my dad was a real music lover, right? 1950s rock and roll, reggae, of course classical. He did not like hip hop at all. Not a fan. So this brings me to the story. When I was 3 years old, he brought me to a public park in Amherst, right? And there were some kids there playing Beastie Boys' License to Ill, very loud, out of a boombox. And he was not happy. And I'm guessing he went over to them and he's like, yeah, can you turn that off? I'm here with my son. And they were told him to screw off or something. And he was getting frustrated. And eventually they went off into the woods or something, maybe to smoke pot. But they left their tape deck with the tape in it playing. And he took matters into his own hands and he went over and stole their cassette. And this is family lore. The tape was in our house for years. I listened to it myself, was a big fan. And last summer, I was alone with him. My mom was in Ireland, and I was looking for things to talk about. And I was like, hey, Dad, do you remember when you stole that Beastie Boys tape? And he was like, yeah, I do. Those kids deserved it. I could have stolen their tape deck, but I just stole their tape. They should have known better than to play rap in public. So he was committed. So that's my dad in a nutshell. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. A lot of you have referenced something that you all knew about my dad, which is that he had kind of a phenomenal memory. But it wasn't, I'm trying to think of the right way to put this. It was something that he was very aware of, but I don't think it was something that he was particularly impressed with in and of itself. I think the way that his memory, the way he found his memory most rewarding was that it wasn't so much about the precision of details, so much as it was a way for him to feel connected to more emotional experiences that he hung on to throughout his life. And many of you talked about what it was like at the end of his life. I talked to my mom about this several times, either in person or over email, and I know that it was a little bit difficult for him to have to let go of the precision of his memory, but I don't know that he would have regarded it as especially tragic. And the reason I don't is because his brother Dave wrote about this. He thought of life as a series of sensations. And to the degree that his memory could help him hang on to those sensations, he valued it. One of the books that he recommended to me when I was a teenager that I hung on to and I go back to pretty consistently was Louis Buñuel's autobiography. It's called My Last Sigh. It's a book that I sometimes reference when I'm teaching classes. I know it's a book that our friend Ted is very fond of, and it has an opening that I think he would have, I know my dad appreciated very much, even though it's something that we never talked about. The language in the translation is one that's so close to his voice as I remember it, that whenever I pick it up or think about it, it's something that kind of conjures up what I think is my favorite part of my memory of him. I'd like to read it. I'll tell you in advance, it's a little extended. It's not terribly long, it's 4 or 5 pages, but if you bear with me through it. And like any passage like this, it has things through, so it has a kind of dynamicism where it comes up and down. I think if you listen, you'll know the particularly salient part of it. It comes near the end. Okay, all right. This is Buñuel writing at the end of his life and remembering his mother, and then reflecting on his own life. During the last 10 years of her life, my mother gradually lost her memory. When I went to see her in Zaragoza, where she lived with my brothers, I watched the way she read magazines, turning the pages carefully one by one from the first to the last. When she finished, I'd take the magazine from her, then give it back, only to see her leaf through it again, slowly, page by page. She was in perfect physical health and remarkably agile for her age, but in the end, she no longer recognized her children. She didn't know who we were or who she was. I'd walk into her room, kiss her, sit with her a while. Sometimes I'd leave, then turn around and walk back in again. She greeted me with the same smile and invited me to sit down, as if we were seeing each other for the first time. She didn't remember my name. When I was a schoolboy in Saragossa, I knew the names of all of the Visigoth kings of Spain by heart, as well as the areas and populations of each country in Europe. In fact, I was a goldmine of useless facts. These mechanical pyrotechnics were the object of countless jokes. Students who were particularly good at it were called memoriones. Virtuoso memorion that I was, I too had nothing but contempt for such pedestrian exercises. Now, of course, I'm not so scornful. As time goes by, we don't give a second thought to all of the memories we so unconsciously accumulate until suddenly, one day, we can't think of the name of a good friend or a relative. It's simply gone. We've forgotten it. In vain, we struggle furiously to think of a commonplace word. It's on the tip of our tongues, but refuses to go any further. Once this happens, there are other lapses, and only then do we understand and acknowledge the importance of memory. This sort of amnesia came upon me first as I neared 70. It started with proper names and with the immediate past. Where did I put my lighter? I had it in my hand just 5 minutes ago. What did I want to say when I started this sentence? All too soon, the amnesia spreads, covering events that happened a few months or years ago. The name of that hotel I stayed at in Madrid in May 1980. The title of a book I was so excited about 6 months ago. I search and search, but it's always futile. I can only wait for the final amnesia, the one that can erase an entire life, as it did my mother's. So far, I've managed to keep this final darkness at bay. From my distant past, I can still conjure up countless names and faces, and when I forget one, I remain calm. I know it's sure to surface suddenly via one of those accidents of the unconscious. On the other hand, I'm overwhelmed by anxiety when I can't remember a recent event, or the name of someone I've met during the last few months, or the name of a familiar object. I feel as if my whole personality has suddenly disintegrated. I've become obsessed. I can't think about anything else, and yet all my efforts and all my rage get me nowhere. Am I going to disappear altogether? The obligation to find a metaphor to describe table is a monstrous feeling, but I console myself with the fact that there is something even worse, to be alive and yet not recognize yourself, not to know any more who you are. You have to begin to lose your memory, if only in bits and pieces, to realize that memory is what makes our lives. Life without memory is no life at all. Just as an intelligence without the possibility of expression is not really an intelligence. Our memory is our coherence, our reason, our feeling, even our action. Without it, we are nothing. Imagine, as I often have, a scene in a film where a man tries to tell a friend a story but forgets one word out of 4, a simple word like car or street or policeman. He stammers, hesitates, waves his hands in the air, gropes for synonyms. Finally, his friend gets so annoyed that he slaps him and walks away. Sometimes, too, resorting to humor to ward off panic, I tell the story about the man who goes to see a psychiatrist, complaining of lapses in memory. The psychiatrist asks him a couple of routine questions, then says, "So, these lapses." "What lapses?" the man replies. The memory may be omnipotent and indispensable, but it's also terribly fragile. The menace is everywhere, not only from its traditional enemy, forgetfulness, but from false memories, like my often repeated story about Paul Nézon's wedding in the 1930s. The church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where he was married, is crystal clear in my mind's eye. I can see the congregation, myself among them, the altar, the priest, even Jean-Paul Sartre, the best man. And then suddenly, one day last year, I said to myself, but that's impossible. Nézon, a militant Marxist, and his wife, who came from a family of agnostics, would never have been married in a church. It was categorically unthinkable. Did I make it up? Confuse it with other weddings? Did I graft a church I know well onto a story that someone told me? Even today, I have no idea what the truth is or what I did with it. Our imagination and our dreams are forever invading our memories. And since we are all apt to believe in the reality of our fantasies, we end up transforming our lies into truths. Of course, fantasy and reality are equally personal and equally felt. So their confusion is a matter of only relative importance. It doesn't much matter. I am the sum of my errors and my doubts, as well as my certainties. Such is my memory. And that's all.
We can just leave this here. All right, I think it's time to, your minds, your hearts have been moved, but your body's just sitting there, I've noticed. How about we stand up and sing? And while we get ready to do this, while Penny gets ready, I'm having a memory irrelevant to this situation, and I'm going to share it with you. When I was young, I lived for a couple of years in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in northeastern Georgia. And I was not a church-going person, but I thought just for anthropological or sociological or narrative reasons, I want to go and check this out. One day, the preacher, who got very excited, in case you haven't heard, they're not really in favor of sin. That was one thing I really understood after a while. And he had a real stem winder of a sermon, and he was cranked up, and he got right to the end, and he said, we ought to take all the dice and all the cards and throw them in the river. We ought to take all the moonshine, all the wine, throw them in the river. We ought to take all the loose women, and all the men are looking. We ought to take all the loose women and throw them in the river. Now, take your hymn book, open to number 34, and we shall sing, Shall We Gather at the River? So shall we, Penny?
It's a beautiful song. So here's
And you don't need your hymn book number 34. It's on your program.
I'll just play the last stanza.
Thank you, and if you want to sit, sit. If you want to stand, stand. I would like to say a prayer and offer a blessing, and then it's time for you to gather at the river at Jim and Gigi's place on Ireland Street in West Chesterfield. And I'm not going to tell you what to say in a prayer, to whom to address it, but I would love it if you could take some of the light and the good humor and the depth of feeling and the wit and the communion and music that we've had here today. Take that, sum it up in your heart, and send it to this beautiful planet and all our neighbors on it, because it is in need of our prayers. And I will begin, dear God, but that's shorthand. Dear God, though we may lose, we ourselves are not lost. Though we may grieve, we're not alone. You are with us even to receive our anger some days. It's all right. We are not ungrateful, only fearful, only natural, when what we love and who we love is so vulnerable. As you can hold the dead and the living, hold all these things within us now. Hold us together as we fall apart. You will put eternity in our hearts and wed our bodies to time. All that we have ever loved is here in our hearts, yet much is gone beyond the reach of our loving arms. Be with us in that balance. Be with us when we lose that balance, for we do. Be with us in our loss and our gratitude, in our need to find meaning in death and to lose ourselves in life. Be with us this day and every day when we face change or doubt or loss. Amen. And now for a closing blessing. May you be safe through the storm. May you be warm through the night. May love be your strength and courage your guide. Your life the right length, and God by your side. Now, leave all regrets here. It's a good place for them. It's what we built the building for. Leave all your regrets here. Take the best of Jim with you, because it connects with the best in you. Thank you. Go in peace. Thank you.